Well, welcome to the Dad Nation podcast, where men go from good to great in their life and love. Listen, now more than ever, our world needs strong, courageous, and compassionate men, because we believe that when the dad gets better, the whole family wins. And now this movement is called Dad Nation, but ultimately this is for the wives, the children, and the generations to come, because we believe that every wife and child deserves a father who is pursuing greatness. I'm your host, Mitchell Osman, and I'm so grateful and humbled that you've chosen to spend your most precious resource, which is your time, with me today. I feel like I say this every single episode, but I am genuinely so excited to introduce you to my friend James, because today we're going to be talking about how to process and express your emotions as men. And I know that this is a huge struggle with many men that I talk and I walk with. So I know that this is going to resonate with you in a deep way. James is a husband and a father of two boys. He's a dynamic presence in the advising and consulting space, where he assists high achievers in overcoming destructive patterns and crippling blind spots. James's background is in psychology, and from an early age, he's had a proclivity for human behavior and being able to recognize and discern themes in people's lives. James has spent his whole professional career in the building up of people, from growing and leading a large international sales team throughout his 20s to sitting on an advisory board of a billion-dollar company where he worked with the founders and the executive team. He founded the McLeod company 5 years ago, where he now works one-on-one with people who have a true hunger to better themselves and the world around them, so that they can be truly impactful while simultaneously deeply fulfilled in their personal and professional lives. So listen, for the sake of time, we're just going to jump straight over to this conversation. So I hope you enjoy. Let's get into it. Well, welcome, James. So glad to have you here on the podcast, my friend. I have been following you for about a year and a bit or so, and just been loving your content and just been watching your journey as you've been kind of growing in influence, and chatting, hearing you tell your stories about what you're learning through your coaching and your family. And I just admire so much of what you're about, how you lead your family with such intentionality, how you prioritize your sons with such your kids with such intentionality. You prioritize your wife, and if there's any guys who are on the internet seeming to do it well, it seems like you, man, you're doing a great job at this balance of how to love your wife well, how to be a great dad and be fully present. And I'm just looking forward to this conversation, as we were talking earlier about what we're going to talk about today. And as you sort of alluded to, growing up in a family of ladies, definitely more intuitive and aware of your emotions. And unfortunately, a lot of us as men aren't that blessed in that. I know you said you cursed a part of your life like that, but a lot of men, this is an area that they very much struggle in. And actually, I talk a lot about that when it comes to emotions and understanding your emotions and being able to communicate your emotions. And I think as men, we get into a lot of trouble because we don't know how to communicate how we feel. And so we expect our wives to read our minds sometimes, or and we're going to get into it. But when you think about why we are this way, and why it is that men, and in your experience with the people that you've walked alongside, why is it that you think we struggle as men to talk about our emotions, to have open and honest dialogue about how we're feeling and when we're feeling? Because personally, I don't know about you, but I think men experience just as many emotions as women, but just women are more intuitive, and they seem to, generally speaking, they seem to have a broader term of descriptors for
That's
their
right.
emotions. Men have like four
That's right.
basic emotions, basically, and after like happy, mad, sad, frustrated, maybe stressed,
Right.
that's about it, right? And so this conversation about emotional awareness, and then empowering men, and creating a space where they can feel comfortable to talk about their emotions, I think is super powerful. And so I'm looking forward to talking with you about this. But so to ask you, in your experience, why is it you think that we have such a hard time with this as men, as fathers, and as husbands?
Most of it, in my experience, of my years in I'm not the most seasoned advisor, but I've logged thousands of hours. It almost unanimously comes down to the relationship to the father. And
Mm,
what most men have lacked is a healthy, positive, well-rounded model of what interfacing with challenged
mm,
and negative emotions actually looks like. We do so
mm,
much modeling. And now, us having little ones, we see how it models. They just want to be like you, right? I mean, they're just walking around with your little shirt on, trying your shoes on, and all this. They want to be little impressions, little basically copies. But the reality is, there are so few people that, and men specifically, I believe, who've learned and actually taken the time to interface with those challenging wounds, those challenging emotions, those things that really
mm,
don't feel good. It's not that they're pleasant, and so in many regards, they're just dismissed entirely. But that doesn't dismiss the negative ramifications of what those harbored negative emotions do. And so a lot of men that I've worked with,
mhm,
they have a great deal of or a lack of emotional intimacy with their father, their earthly father. They never had that
mm,
emotional intimacy. They never had that emotional connection. And so by that, they never saw it modeled that you could feel sad and compose yourself, that you could feel angry and remain in
mm,
control, that you could feel strong emotions but not lose their temper. And so we've seen, and we in many ways are recreating what we saw modeled, or we're swinging the pendulum to the other side, and we are doing the exact opposite in many regards of what we saw modeled. And we're bathing in negative emotions, and it's just all just so
mm,
bad and terrible. And I believe there's a middle ground for quite a lot of things in life. But to answer your question in short, I've seen it to be there hasn't been a real emphasis or education and empowerment about interfacing with the negative emotions that we as human beings all experience on a
mm.
daily or weekly basis. We just haven't seen it modeled.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this in a call we had a little while ago, but and I think I mentioned this in the first episode, but there's a psychological term for it, or that I've read about, and it's called a normative male alexithymia, and how psychologists have actually just identified this as sort of what happens to specifically males and men, how we're raised in a culture and taught to suppress our feelings and to just kind of tough it up, and real men don't cry, and just suppress and depress, and of course all the negative ramifications
Right.
that come from that. And so no doubt, man, I can certainly resonate with that. I know I've struggled a lot with that in the past, and I know that I've talked with countless men who have struggled with that in the past. I was listening to a podcast a little while ago, and he was talking about how he said, I don't think that I think it was Man Talks, who the podcast was, and he was saying, I don't think we fully acknowledged the repercussions of what have come out of, um, for example, World War
I
II
was just
and these
about to say
wars that
that.
were happening. Yeah, and men come home with massive, massive amounts of trauma that they experienced, and of course, what do? They medicate. They don't talk about it. They stuff it down, and of course, that generation raised another generation who then, of course, didn't talk about how they feel because it wasn't modeled for them, like you said. And then now there's our generation who's coming from that. And so we're really just one generation removed from a lot of these men that have experienced pretty extreme trauma, right? One or two generations. And it's when you think about it like that, I mean, it
Mhm.
really makes sense as to why so many men haven't modeled it in the past, right?
Definitely.
I read this quote a little while ago. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on it. It says, "As a man, you need to be a thermostat, not a thermometer." So, as a father and a husband, you don't necessarily react to the temperature like a thermostat, but you set the temperature like a thermometer. And sometimes it's our responsibility just to simply be the lowest
That's right.
heartbeat in the room, right? When you come home from work and your wife has had a crazy day, the kids are kind of going bonkers, and sometimes it's just our responsibility to just be the calm in the midst of the storm. Would you agree with that in your
I would,
experience?
and I would throw a huge caution to that, though. For me, one of the biggest pitfalls that I've had to really, I would say, recover from in many regards in my life is codependency. And so taking on other people's
Mm,
emotions and their emotional well-being as my own responsibility, which is a
mm,
huge detriment to the whole family unit, because you can't give from things
Mm.
that you do not have. You cannot pull from resources that you do not have. So when you get into that space, then you're doing what we call self-sacrifice, which is we would like to think that it's humble and that it's really virtuous, when in all actuality it's very prideful and very selfless, because what you're not doing is you're not raising your hand saying, hey, i
Mhm.
i actually need help, and while I'd really love to do this X, Y, and Z around the house, I'm being very honest, I just don't have the capacity for it right now. That is a terrifying thing
Mhm.
to articulate as a man to a woman. And in many regards, it's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength, because it takes great courage to be honest. It takes great courage to be able to look within and recognize where you actually are in the moment. And so I would agree that we as men,
Mhm.
especially as fathers and husbands, we are to be the thermostat, and we come in, but the only way you're
Mhm.
able to be a thermostat is by mastering yourself to the greatest ability that you can. And part of that
Mhm.
self mastery is willing to be honest, willing to remain sober, willing to exhibit discipline. And if you're not willing to tell the
Mm.
truth, then you will not be in self mastery. You will actually be in denial, which is living outside of reality. It's living in a fantasy world where
Mhm.
you're willingly rejecting something that is actively happening in front of you, which then will create an immediate friction
Mhm.
between you and your spouse or you and your kids. And you'll say it's fine, but underneath there's a boiler that's boiling up, and all it takes is one kid to kick bed one more time and say, I'm not going to bed right
Mhm.
now, and then these dads snap. And what that really comes down to is
Yeah.
a, a repetitive nature to deny yourself of that which you really need.
Yeah, that dude, that's so true. I think going along with some of this cultural things that we've adopted along the way as men, you're right, man. With this putting this caveat to it, it's like sometimes we feel like we have to just own it all. We have to carry that burden. We have to carry the weight and deny ourselves. What we need. I've been reading a book called No More Mr.
Mm,
Nice Guy, and it's just talking a little bit about this concept of what happens when men suppress their needs, emotional needs, physical needs, and actually in a desire to serve their families or serve their spouses, but what actually begins to manifest out of that when we live in such a suppressed, depressed state. And it's pretty wild. I think a lot of men, at least I used to think self-care was
hmm.
self-absorbed. It's like, if I just took care of myself that way, then I'd be ignoring everyone else and just caring
Totally.
about myself, right? But it's the old oxygen
That's
mask
right.
dropping
We
down on the
all
plane. It's
know.
like if you don't put
That's
on
right.
your right, we've all seen it
That's
a
right.
million times, but it's just accurate, right? I heard somebody talking about it a little while ago. They said self care is not selfish; it's self-ish. It means taking care of yourself so that you can better take
Hmm.
care of others. Right now, it doesn't mean being lazy. It doesn't mean ignoring your family. But it doesn't mean that you check out totally and play video games and self medicate, but it's simply thinking about yourself. It's
That's
self
right.
ish, not
That's right. Well,
selfish.
and
You
and
know what I mean?
so,
No, it's all
I mean,
you.
you're spot on with that, Mitch. And the thing that I find that many guys they go to the exact thing that you're talking about, where their self care is disengaging. Their self care is video games, is drinking, is looking at things on the internet, is just going, and being gone for the entire weekend with the boys because they're like, oh, I deserve this. This is self care. But there's an element to that that is very unhealthy, because what you're not doing is actually interfacing with that which needs to be addressed. How is your soul? How is the
Mm,
condition of your heart? What are things that you need that you've been too scared
mm,
to ask? I mean, you want to talk about
mm,
facing giants. You want to talk about living with intention and engagement. You get in a room full of men and you start asking these questions, and the room gets real quiet. Why? Because we'd much rather
yeah.
talk about Call of Duty or talk about our favorite beer, or just, kick back in a cocktail. And look, I'm all for a time and place for those things. But when we're talking about the condition of the heart, this is the internal work that so many men run from. And it's what creates this vacant
Mm-hmm.
vacuum inside of their home. And
Mm,
everybody feels it. And they
mm-hmm.
want to be engaged. They want to be
Mm-hmm.
involved. They love their kids. They love their wife.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that they don't, but there's a deep fear that
Mm-hmm.
they might be saying, what if people know? What if people find out that
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't have it all together? What if people find out that I
Mm,
actually have some fears that I don't know I really believe in myself? As men, that's like
mm.
unforgivable sin. You just can't say stuff like that. And if you can, it's in like a
Mm-hmm.
passing comment on the golf course, or we have a 30-second conversation. It's like, oh yeah, like that's cool. Then we just shake it off like it didn't happen. But there's a real space for these conversations to take place so that there can be real healing. Because when a father is healed, and when a father does the work to heal himself,
Mm-hmm.
it brings such a healing balm to the whole family. Everybody benefits from it. I think it pays higher
Mm-hmm.
dividends than any sort of
Mm-hmm.
healing or restoration that could take place in a family unit.
Hey, I promise we're going to get back to this episode, but I just wanted to take a few seconds to tell you about a free marriage course that I'm offering, no charge, and it's called Remodel Your Marriage. And it's a 4-step blueprint to understanding your wife, keeping your cool, and getting the fire back in your marriage. And in this course, we're going to dig into the 4 foundations that every successful couple understands well. And that's number 1, how to love each other well. Number 2, how to feel and how to communicate how you feel, how to communicate through conflict. Number 3 is how to fight fair and how to fight well. And then number 4 is how to have fun and to break out of that routine of becoming just really great roommates. And so if you're watching this and maybe you would say that your marriage is feeling a little stale, maybe needs a little remodeling or refreshing, all you need to do is head to dadnationco.com/remodel for that free course for you, my friend. I put a lot of time and energy into it, and I believe that it can help you transform your marriage. I believe in the marriage model. I believe in you and your marriage, my friend. All right, let's get back to the episode. Yeah, man. I feel that, man. And that's why I say often, you'll hear me say on the podcast, when the dad gets better, the
That's
whole
right.
family wins. Because I do just so firmly believe that we do certainly set a tone in a lot of different ways, and we carry a certain thing into the family. And then when the father's off, in a lot of ways, the family suffers, and vice versa. When the father improves himself, whether it's spiritually, emotionally, physically, whatever the case is, he sets a trajectory for the rest of his family. And that's exactly why I'm talking to you today about our emotions, because I want to help
Mm-hmm.
normalize this for men. There's a book that I read a little while ago called Your One Life by an author named Lance Witt. And the quote came to me, so I just pulled it up and I'll read it to you. And it's about emotional health. And it says, emotional health is like having a good set of shock absorbers for your soul. When the shocks are working well, they help absorb life's bumps and potholes. But when your shock absorbers are worn out and you hit a pothole, you bottom out and the ride is rough. You also need to remember that when your soul isn't healthy, you make the ride rough for everyone else on the journey with you, right? And I think that's a really cool analogy that helps paint that picture for how we do set the tone, and sometimes we make the ride rough for everyone else in the family if we're not intentional about our health and our soul care and our physical care and our
Mm-hmm.
emotional care and all those things, right? So yeah, this is you're hitting all the right spots, man. This is good stuff. So when we think about how this plays out, right? When you talk with men who have a hard time processing their emotions and thinking about how to care for themselves, how do you see this playing out in their marriages and in their parenting? So what happens when they don't acknowledge their inner life, so to
Huge
speak?
amounts of chaos and disconnectedness.
Mm,
There's usually
mhm,
a great deal of frustration that's probably germinated into the level of resentment, which is a cancer. That's a deep
mhm,
anger. So a lot of unmet needs that ha- the man hasn't voiced, but like you said, he expects just the wife to know. So there's a very high
mhm,
amount of pressure and expectations from the man on the woman, which
mhm,
creates a real strong disconnect and constant disappointments, constant, you're not doing enough. I don't feel seen, acknowledged. Now, this isn't necessarily articulated. It's just communicated in body language and tone and little remarks. And then
mhm,
when it comes to the kids, there are times of playfulness. There are times of very, joyous engagement, but the hammer falls heavy and their fuse is short. And when they're disciplining or when they're correcting, it's firm and oftentimes not done from a place of love, but rather they're reacting versus responding, and they're reacting from a place of anger rather than responding from a place of
mm,
love, which anybody that's listening to this
Mm.
probably can, recall different times in their life where a parent, you distinctly remember them responding from a place of anger, and that marked you. You can see their face. You can hear the tone almost come through again to your psyche. And
Mhm.
so the
Mhm.
men that I work with, many of them, they haven't controlled their tongue. They haven't been able to control and get a control of their tongue. And in a lot of ways, many of them have deep internal frustration within themselves that comes out in the form of frustration and critique on everything else in their life.
Yeah, man. It's so funny you mentioned that. I remember times growing up as a kid. You, I can remember facial
Hmm.
expressions. I can remember vocal tones. I can remember very specific words, body movements, very much burned in my memory of times when people would totally lose their cool or whatever the case is. And so, yeah, it's so interesting. I was on Instagram just looking at a couple things last night, and somebody had made a reel about their just kid was just crawling along the sand, and they said every time I want to give up on this parenting journey, I remember that I'm holding someone else's childhood in
Hmm.
my hands. And when you think about your childhood and all those memories, the thousands of memories you have, the fact that as a father, you are actually holding that amount for someone else, you're creating that for them. It just blew my mind. I'm like, I've never really thought about it
Mm.
that way, and it's powerful. And I think because of that, it's so important for us to think about how we manage our emotions so that we don't, like you said, have a short fuse and explode and things like that. So okay, awesome, and I totally agree with you on all this. But now I want to kind of get into some of the practical stuff to help, man. So, um, say if you're in a situation, say I don't know. I got a
Hmm.
couple kids. I'm married. I got a stressful job, and I'm just finding it hard to keep my cool. I just losing my temper, and I'm losing it on my wife or my kids. I'm just not. I'm not stepping up the way I need to. Not showing up the way I need to emotionally. How would we take the steps? How would you coach somebody to take the steps to acknowledge and address their feelings, and really, like, how would they begin to do the work so that they could begin to acknowledge some of these feelings and then begin to learn how to communicate them and lengthen that
Hmm.
fuse, if you will?
So what I would just probe you with, because one of the big things that I do, I'm a researcher, I'm an investigator. I want to get in and I want to get pop the hood, and I get what people tell me, but I want to get
Mhm.
under and find out what really is going on. And so, some questions I would ask would be, where do you find the most tension in your life right now? How do you find that manifesting?
Mm.
What do you find unsatisfying about your life? How long has that been going on? Talk to me about your childhood. What was it
Mm.
like at your home? How was your relationship with your father? How was your relationship with your mother? Now, while I ask these questions, before I get to that point, what I talk to them about is honesty. Because if you're not willing to be honest about what's going on inside, and you're just going to keep telling yourself the same
Mm.
story, that it's the world's fault, it's the government's fault, it's my parents' fault, it's everybody else's fault, and you're not about to take responsibility and ownership for the role you've played, then the conversation isn't worth having. Because the reality is, you and I both have
Mm.
choices that we get to make, and a hard truth is that I am where I am in my life based off as a byproduct of the choices that I have either made or not made. And so taking this
Mm.
radical responsibility, like deep responsibility, that, okay, I didn't get to control who my family was and what area of the world I grew up in. I didn't control any of that. But now I'm an adult, and I can take jurisdiction, and I can take responsibility. And so a huge empowering part is really talking to men, saying, hey, are you ready to take radical responsibility for your life? That means no excuses. That means no offing it on anybody else, but saying,
Mm.
this is mine. This is mine to bear and to sort through. So a willingness to
Mm.
tell the truth is a huge variable to all of this success. And so when it comes to
Mm.
emotions, though, many people grow up in an environment where their fight or flight response is pretty hyperactive. There's a lot of stress. There's some very strong core memories that get that sympathetic nervous system firing. And most people, especially in today's world,
Mhm.
thanks to technology, and we have an exorbitant amount of information that we've never had access to before, keeps that amygdala firing all of the time. So we wake up, people check their phone, bang, you're in fight or flight. And you pretty much continue that way all day until you get home and you have a glass of whiskey and whatnot. And
Mm.
then that does a whole different chemical reaction into your body. So the first thing that I talk to people about after being honest, is I talk to them about their breath. Why? Because your breath is a very integral part of with your autonomic nervous system. So your heartbeat is a part of your autonomic nervous system. We can't control our heartbeat. We can't just sit here and think and lower our heartbeat. But our breath is part of our autonomic nervous system. It's going all of the time. And we can take that part of our body and our anatomy and we can move that into our conscious being and actually control our breath. Now, the first thing that happens when people get angry, physiologically speaking, is their breath changes. When you have a stress response in a matter of milliseconds, a chemical reaction goes to your amygdala and says there's a threat of some sort. Either I'm being disrespected, somebody's about to leave me, I'm fearing rejection, and the first thing to change is you shorten your breath. And so if I can help men bring into awareness their breath, where they're not breathing up here in their chest, because that's not how we were supposed to breathe in the thoracic part of our body. You're supposed to breathe down here in your diaphragm, in your belly, where your belly moves out in your nose, not your mouth. Just by doing this, and people like Alex Huberman has confirmed it, you're signaling up to your amygdala actually real chemicals that you are safe and there's not a threat. So here as men, when we're constantly being, whether it's in our professional life or personal life, just by controlling your breath, and I've seen men have just the most profound experiences, Mitch, from this, of saying, look, I was having a conversation with my wife. I was in control of my breath. I was what I call breath conscious, where I was conscious of my breathing and I did not lose it. Why? Because if you can control your breath, inevitably it takes breath to talk. So when I'm spitting at you and I'm saying harshful things, my breath is short and quick. But if I slow down, I'm giving myself some room to think and really like say what I actually want to say, not what I'm just reflexively saying. But B, that gives my whole being a chance to calm down and stay out of a state of fight or flight. And so in just a very practical sense, when it comes to managing emotions, it's all about managing your reflexes and retraining those to where you're not lashing out right when you hear a tone from your wife or your kids, but you take a breath. And it sounds super easy, sounds super foundational. You would not believe how challenging it is in the beginning. But I teach people that all throughout your day, because people breathe incorrectly almost all day, every day. And you breathe about 20,000 times a day. So if you're breathing 20,000 times a day incorrectly for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, that's going to have some negative consequences. Okay. So you'll be sitting in the afternoon and people will just be sitting there at their desk working, and all of a sudden they'll go, this involuntary big breath. That's your brain. That's your autonomic nervous system taking control of your breath and bringing in more oxygen because your brain is depleted in oxygen. So that's where this big sigh comes from. So if you're conscious of your breath, it will regulate everything so much better. And then when you're willing to engage in that state with honesty of what's actually happening right now, where am I really experiencing this tension? All right, I'm afraid. All anger is fear. All anger is fear. So if you're angry, you're afraid. What am I afraid of? Am I inadequate?
Wow.
What am I threatened by? Or do I feel insufficient? Do I feel unqualified? What is it? When you start getting to that level of truth, that's where, that's where some real healing I found can really take place, because you're willing to put words to things that most oftentimes haven't put words to. It's challenging to do by yourself, I will admit. I've had people speak into my life. I've had mentors, advisors, coaches, consultants for years, and I highly recommend that for anybody who's wanting to do this type of work, because it's challenging to navigate the landscape of the soul by yourself, let alone with somebody else. But that's where I would begin with someone.
All all anger stems from fear. Wow, I'm just thinking about the times that I've been upset in my life, and of course, it's kind of like that concept of teachings on love and respect, and how women crave to be loved and men crave to be respected. And oftentimes you'll ask men, would you rather hear the words "I love you" or "I
That's right.
respect you"? And a lot of men would rather actually hear the words "I respect you" than "I love you." I know for me, when I was asked that question, I was like, dang, I think I'd actually take "I respect you." And when my wife says, I love how strong of a husband you are and how hard you work for our family, I respect you so much, it means infinitely more than "I love you," right? And it's just kind of how we're wired. But But a lot of times when I think about the times that we've had conflict in the past, it can go back to feeling disrespected, which of course can trace back to, anger, which then can be traced back to fear and unwillingness to speak about genuinely what I'm afraid of. I love that, man.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing you say is breath work, focusing on your
That's where it
breath
begins.
is really
That's
important
where it
for us as
begins.
men.
That's where it
Yeah.
begins. And the reason I start there is because it's very elementary. But if you, all emotions are, it's a signaling system. Okay. So emotions are
Mm,
beautiful. God gave us emotions. He gave us emotions to understand when something is a threat, when, something's happy and great and joyous, and when something's sad. It's fantastic. But where people have a challenging time articulating is because they've created a disassociation between them and their feelings. And so the signal system between the
mm,
mind and body, which is very real, the mind body connection is incredibly real and profound when it comes to, especially there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's about how the body
mm,
stores trauma. And it's not some woo woo thing. It's real. It's evidence based. And so when you can,
mhm,
with breath, it's very easy. First off, it's very simple. And I'll be on the phone with certain men, and we'll sit there and just breathe a couple of times. I don't even have to say anything, and the emotions are right there. They're right under the surface, and they'll just
mhm,
start welling up, and they'll just start feeling these feelings.
mhm,
And I tell them, first off, the emotion, you don't repress emotions, you don't suppress them. That's not how you deal with them. You allow yourself to feel them, and then release the energy behind them, so that it can flow like a wave, and then
mhm,
be done. All emotions, they don't last forever. They come in waves. But if I'm constantly trying to resist, that's only going to create more problems for me. And so I start with the breath because it
mhm,
tunes guys into the signals that are going on. Oh. Okay, I recognize
mm,
how I'm reacting right now. Okay, so I'm not, angry. I'm I'm afraid. What am I afraid of? I'm afraid that I'm going to turn out like my dad. And so I'm trying to be the opposite. And I don't want my kid to treat da 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 da. Da. Okay. So that's all that is awareness. But you only get to that awareness when you slow
mm,
down and you can be within your body, because emotions are expressed through the body. So if you're not tuned in there, then
mhm,
you have your ears plugged and your eyes closed, and you're trying to discern what's going on, which is very just not effective.
mhm. So good. Yeah. A lot of times when I'm talking to men, I'll ask them to in the moment observe what's happening
Hmm.
physically. So like as you said, emotions often manifest themselves physically. So I have a couple dead giveaways when my blood
Hmm.
pressure starts to raise. And so I'll ask, man, hey, or even ask your wife, what does she see
That's right.
you doing when she can sense that you're about to snap? Are you for me, my thing is like I start rubbing my hands
Mm.
together, right? It's just a weird thing I picked up, but a lot of men feel like a tightness in their chest or their head literally feels hot. And as men, we can be so tactile and so thinking about that and having the ability to stop in the moment and decide how you will respond, but observe the physical state. The great thing about that is going forward, when you start feeling your body doing those things, that can actually alert your mind and your emotions, right? Which has been super helpful for me in the past. I know that. I read a book a while ago called 10% Happier by Dan Harris. And it's a little bit about meditation and mindfulness
Hmm.
and stuff like that. He went on a bunch of different retreats and mindfulness retreats. And in the book, he talks a little bit about what the monks taught him about practicing mindfulness. And he says, basically, right, picture the mind like a waterfall. The water is a torrent of thoughts and emotions. And mindfulness is the space behind the waterfall. It's not easy, but
Hmm.
it's simple. But this idea of like when you're caught up in your emotions and you feel like you don't have any control, it's like you're caught up in that
Hmm.
current and you're like stuck in the bottom of the waterfall and you're being pushed around by
That's
your
right.
emotions. But this image of actually getting out and getting behind the waterfall and observing your emotions
That's
from a
right.
distance and speaking to them and not being tossed and turned by them. When Sam and I were in Hawaii, we went to Kauai a couple of years ago, and there's this giant waterfall. And I remember getting up, like being swimming around the base of it. It was pretty freaky. But then when you get up behind it, you can just see the mass
Mm.
magnitude of this water, but you can enjoy it because it doesn't affect you, right? And I love that imagery of standing behind the waterfall and how it represents sort of awareness, because now oftentimes I'll ask myself in the moment, I'm like, get out of the current,
Hmm.
right? Get out of the current and get behind the waterfall and observe my emotions, because I don't have to be ruled by them, right? I was talking to Adam, the last guest on my podcast a little while ago, and talking a little bit about how we're different from the
Hmm.
animals, right? That's how we have an elevated way of thinking, which I think is what you're talking about. Like a lion doesn't, when he's going through the safari, he's not like looking at a zebra and thinking, well, should I eat this zebra? But I had some elk before, and he's not thinking, but he's just thinking like, I'm hungry
That's
now. I
right.
will eat. It's instinct. But us as humans, and we were talking about the context of food, but I had said, we can look at a slice of chocolate cake, but then we can elevate our thinking and think, should I should I eat that or should I not? Well, I had this earlier and I'm going to have this later. So I'm going to observe that thought from a
Right.
distance and make a decision to not do that thing. And that's what I love about this idea of mindfulness and elevating your way of thinking, because and I think that's the hard part. We are so reactive, right? We're not proactive at all in how we just feel things and boom, it's all out, right? And if we could just kind of and I think what you're saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this breathing process allows us to create some space between our emotions so that we can
That's right.
process,
It
right?
very much so does, and part of, again, getting back to this radical responsibility, and so the exact mindfulness that you're talking about, I use in the vernacular I use is being objective. So we're required as men to be objective about what's going on, not subjective and what we
Mm,
think or interpreting them based off of our childhood experiences. We have to see it for actually how it is, which is a skill. Like most of these things, it's a skill. But when it comes to radical responsibility, you're when you're willing to step into that place, no more can you say, well, this is just how I am. You can't use excuses like that, because that's just not
mm,
available anymore. You have a choice. And so
mhm,
by separating, what I say is that you separate the emotions from the events that have shaped them, because
mm,
we oftentimes stack emotions. So people, a guy who's trying to really get his life on track, he's like, all right, I'm just like not going to be overwhelmed. Like I'm just going to be focused on my, how great life is. I'm going to be positive. I'm going to be upbeat. I'm going to focus on everything great,
mm,
affirmations, gratitudes, whatever. Just not going to be overwhelmed. And then he finds himself on a Thursday and he's overwhelmed again. But then what he does is he stacks emotions. So we have an emotional home that all of us live in, and we will gravitate towards just inevitably. And most times people will unconsciously seek out those emotions because the mind associates familiarity with safety. So, for instance, I was addicted to disappointment for a long time. Now, most people don't think about being addicted to emotions, but people very much so are. And so, by being addicted to
mm,
that emotion of disappointment, my egoic mind said, "This emotion is safe." It doesn't mean that it's profitable. It doesn't mean that it's good, but it's safe because the
mm,
ego doesn't want to change. It doesn't want to evolve. It doesn't like any of that. The main job of the ego is self preservation. It's full stop. And so so
mm,
what I will then do is what we term as self-sabotage. I will be getting great head of steam. And then the ego goes, well, we don't like this. We don't know what it is to feel joyous, to feel carefree. So we're going to create a feeling of disappointment. So I'll sabotage something so that I can feel disappointed, whether I'll torpedo a conversation with my wife and I'll blame her for something. And then at the end of the night, I'm like, when I get sobriety again, I'll go, why the heck did I do that? Why did I say that? That was so stupid. I didn't even want to say this.
mm,
This is about our emotional reflexes. And so by by
mm,
helping by helping men not stack those, so getting back to, I feel overwhelmed, but then I feel frustrated that I'm overwhelmed, so now I'm judging the emotion that I'm feeling.
mm,
Okay, so now this is secondary.
mm,
Now I get mad at myself because I'm feeling frustrated about being overwhelmed. So everybody does, not just men, but we stack these emotions. So emotions, we're not to judge our emotions. There's really no such thing as good or bad emotions. It's only the meaning that we put behind those emotions that make them good or bad. So being
mm,
objective is about saying, I'm feeling the feeling of anger right now. I feel disrespected, and sitting with it. Not judging myself for feeling this way, not getting to that point, simply investigating and being
mm,
curious rather than judgmental. This allows for such clarity. And then you're looking at it from an objective standpoint. And if you pair that with breathing and you're in a relaxed state physically, because most will carry our tension somewhere in our body, whether our shoulders, our back, our jaw. If you're physically,
Mhm.
and every time you exhale, you're softening your body, the, the clarity will come right there. And you can make amends. You can apologize. You can say, "Hey,
Mm.
I'm sorry I said that. I own that. I'm." And so, anyways, it's all
Mm.
encompassing. There's layers to it, but those emotional reflexes are like anything for any baseball or any sports players. You go to the baseline, you go to the free throw line rather, and you just shoot that shot. You get with that feeling of what that repetition of walking in sobriety, emotional sobriety feels like, and then you can deploy that in
Mm.
higher stress, higher tension filled situations where you can be the calm to the storm. You can be that thermostat.
So good. Have you ever heard of the RAIN
The
method?
ring method.
So it's just simple. It's something that I walk my guys through. It's an acronym for how to keep your cool and practice sort of mindfulness
Sure.
in the moment when you experience
Hmm.
those feelings, right? Because you're right, man. We not only do we feel those feelings, but then when we judge those feelings, we judge ourselves, and we develop feelings
That's right.
about those feelings, and it's a
That's right.
vicious cycle, right? So this acronym R stands for recognize, right? And so that simply means to acknowledge your feelings in the moment, right? To stop and recognize the reality of the situation and that your emotions are elevated. Basically, just admitting the reality of what's going on. And then A is to allow. And this is the process where you lean into your thoughts and your feelings and you give yourself permission to accept them and tell yourself that it's okay to feel this way. Like you said, feelings aren't good or bad, they're just
Hmm.
signals, right? I stands for investigate. So now that you've recognized and allowed the situation and acknowledged your feelings, now you can investigate your thoughts, right? And this is kind of where it gets tactical because this is where we start thinking about these physical cues that I was talking about. Investigate what's going on in your body and in your mind. And the fourth one, which is N, non-identification. And this is the most probably important step. And this is kind of what you're saying. You're not identifying with the feeling. Like, so you would be telling yourself in that moment, I'm not an angry person because I'm feeling angry right now, or I'm not a sad man or miserable. It's just a feeling I'm
That's right.
experiencing and I won't identify with that. And so this acronym of recognize, allow, investigate, and non-identification, if men can like kind of work themselves through that acronym, sometimes in situations it helps them kind of go through that process of dissociating from some of those negative things and going over the deep end and blowing up and losing their cool kind of thing. And for me, that's been a really cool tool that I've used
Yeah.
personally, and that I know is
Man,
helpful
that's
for
so
everyone.
good.
If you don't mind me
That's so
adding
good. Come on,
to
man.
what you're
That was
sharing.
awesome. I love that. I might take that and run with it. That's really good. And those little acronyms are powerful, especially when you're heat of the moment and you need something to draw on. So I love that.
Well, glad it helps. I'm a big acronym geek, or like these little tools and little nuggets and hacks and stuff like that. It's just super helpful. I'm a pretty practical kind of
Yeah.
person as well. I don't love conceptual, big abstract thinking. I love is like how can I take this? What can I do
Hmm.
right now? In this moment. So with that, man, speaking about practicality, I got one more
Hmm.
question for you. So say for example, we've talked about what do you do as a man who's in the, you're feeling that pressure rising. We've talked about breath. We've talked about recognizing your feelings. We've talked about normalizing all that. But then on the flip side, I know with me, and I've shared this in my first podcast episode, explaining the vision of why I started this in the first place. But I talked about how I became a very apathetic person. I just became like a shell of a man. And if you knew me before, I was incredibly passionate, just like all in on everything. And then with the tension and when me and my wife went through that dark season, I actually withdrew and I became apathetic. I became completely checked out emotionally, and I began to medicate and just cope with different other things. And so if there's a man listening today and he's experiencing something like that, like he feels himself checking out, he feels himself just becoming more and more apathetic, not caring, coping through other different things. What kind of advice would you give that man? What would be some steps that you would tell them that would be helpful to take?
First thing, stop believing the lie that you're the only one feeling the way you're feeling. It's garbage. It's the number
Mm.
one tactic of any of any enemy is to isolate. You are not alone. I promise you. Both you and I, Mitch, have felt this way.
Mm.
So, probably more than we would like to admit. And so to hear us talking about
Mhm.
what we're talking about, I didn't live here. Wasn't born here. I've been through a lot of stuff, my own coping mechanisms, my own addictions, my own things where I was trying to escape reality. So first thing is to stop believing the lie that I'm the only one feeling this. Second thing is reach out to someone. Look, Mitch, you've put this podcast together, this community, this Dad Nation community together to unify people who have a common goal to be our best selves in whatever capacity that is. Look, you have several means to reach out to this man who's running this podcast. Email him, reach out via Instagram, call him if his phone number is somewhere, comment on a video, say, I need help. Oftentimes, that's all it takes is just one signal to guys like you and I to say, okay, I got it. I know somebody, he's calling for help. It
Mm.
doesn't need to be this big, hey, I need to write a big long letter about everything that I'm feeling. Come on, that's not where it begins. It begins by acknowledging, like you were saying, Mitch, that if this continues on, we're going to have some real problems. And so I'm hearing these two
Mm.
guys, they can admit to having their own issues and their own problems, their own, forms of possibly regret or where they would like to go back and change things. And they've now come out on the other side. I just want to at least have a conversation with them. Like that's as practical as I could possibly get
Mm.
because it's a lie again to
Mhm.
think that you're in this alone. And it's another lie to think that you have to do this alone. Like just drop the ego. Like we're all in this
Mm.
together. And I love that you've
Mhm.
created this and that, I even got to come on and have a conversation with you about it. So if you're listening to this and any of this has
Mm.
resonated of like, dang, like I wake up with apathy. I wake up disengaged. I wake up coping and wishing that I could just not, go through the day. I just implore you, reach out either to Mitch. You feel free to reach out to me on Instagram, wherever, like just to have a conversation. You're not alone, and you never know what sort of resources or just freedom can come by simply acknowledging that you're feeling certain things. That's all I'll say. And I hope that you take a step to do that because for me, it was very scary in the beginning. I didn't want anybody. I thought my whole being was just going to
Mm.
implode if people thought that I wasn't perfect. I didn't have it all together. I wasn't Hercules or Thor or whatever. And it come to find out, everybody was like, "Hey, man, I get it. I really do, and I'm here to walk you through it." So you have this resource
Mhm.
here in this podcast and this Instagram page that you've created, Mitch. So thank you for that, and that's what I would tell somebody who's listening.
Come on, you're preaching, brother. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Hey, we're going to get back to the episode, but while I have you here, I wanted to ask you, would you consider helping a brother who's struggling in his life right now? Maybe it's a guy searching the internet to help save his marriage, his health, or his family. Maybe it's a man that's just behind you on this journey. And we know, statistically speaking, there are thousands of men doing this, and we know that there are probably men in your social circles that are struggling with some of these very same things. If you'd be willing to help, this is how you can help, and I promise it'll take less than 60 seconds. If you've gotten any value from this podcast so far, would you be willing to give us an honest review and subscribe to our channel, whatever channel you're listening on? If you want to take this to the next level, would you consider sending this link to a friend of yours who you know would benefit from listening to this show? Now, why would you do that? Because the more men that hear this content, the more marriages we can save, the more fathers we can help step up, and the more lives that we can change forever. This isn't just for the men. This is for the wives, the children, and the generations to come. So I want to say thank you so much for doing your part to help other men find the support that they need. Now let's get back to it. I heard a quote a little while ago that it stuck with me. It takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a village to raise a
Mhm.
father. And I was like,
That'll
dang,
preach.
man, ain't that the truth? So many times in my life, man, I've been carrying a burden, and I've been like in my marriage, or like I felt like this monster because I felt this way, or I was experiencing these things. I'm like, I can't tell anybody this. And there was one time it took me like 6 months to get up the courage to talk to a friend of mine. And I went out, just grabbed a beer with him, and I said, "Hey, man," and like I'm
Mhm.
sweating, and I'm like, "Hey, have you ever experienced this?" I mean, it took me forever. He's like, "Oh yeah, like every second
Mhm.
week, bro. We've been dealing with this for 10 years in my marriage." I'm like, "You
Yeah.
kidding me?" Like, and he just
Just
instantly
diffused it totally.
normalized
Yeah.
this thing that I was carrying forever, for like 2
Yeah.
years, and I felt like a monster, and he was like, "Oh, no, that's totally something that I deal with and
Yeah.
most guys do." And it was just the I guess the weight that was lifted off of me and the power that came with bringing what was in the darkness
That's right.
into the light. It was just so visceral and impacting, man. It was just wild. So I agree with you, brother. I love that approach. And of course, I'm biased, but yeah, come
That's
talk
right.
to me too.
That's
I
right.
mean, I'm happy to hear from all you reaching out, because that's exactly why we exist. That's exactly why we started this. I learned a lot of lessons the very hardest way possible. And if at the end of my life, I can go to my grave knowing that I have helped men restore their relationships with their wives and restore relationships with their children, then that will be a life well lived, in my opinion. And so, you know what? I got one last question for you before we wrap it up. Speaking about the end of our life, I ask every guest this. Okay, it's a little bit morbid, but I'm like like a big picture kind of guy. And so I ask everybody, I want you to picture, okay, you've passed away and you're having there's your funeral's happening and you're having this bit of out of body experience. Okay, so you're able to observe what's going on. The funeral's over, and your family after the funeral's over, they're just sitting around the table, and they're reminiscing about you. And they're reminiscing about the husband you were, the father you were, the legacy you left. And then your kids start to speak up and talk about the man that you were. Now you can watch this from a distance and hear what they're saying. And so, what is the one or two things that you would love for your children to speak about you and how you were as a man and the legacy you left?
My dad walked in truth, and my dad walked in love in all things that he did. He was a man of character, he was a man of
Mm,
integrity, and he loved and lived a deeply passionate life.
mm,
That's it. That's it.
that's
That's the
good.
lottery for me. That's the lottery. Yeah.
That's it. So you don't want them to talk about you making $1 million or being super
Yeah.
jacked or
No.
anything like that? Oh,
No.
that's fine. No, that's cool, man.
Yeah, that's it.
Walking in truth and walking in love, man. That's massive. Well, hey, James, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I know that every person that's going to be listening to this podcast is going to walk away feeling like that they're not a monster, that they're going to know how to process how they feel, and they're going to have actionable steps on how to move forward and how to do the deep work that they need to do to be a better man for their children and for their marriage. And so, thank you so much for what you've shared today. I'm so thankful for your time. And listen, last thing, where can we find you? If there's a guy listening to this or a woman,
Mhm.
whoever, where can we find you on the old
Yeah,
interwebs?
James McLeod. It's underscore James McLeod underscore on Instagram. I follow this, Dad Nation page, so you can find me there. My website is jamesmcleod.org, and so there's a contact form if you want to hop on a free discovery call and just chat with me more offline and dive deeper. That'll be complimentary to you. So those are the two best places. Either just jump in my DMs or shoot me an email from that place.
Cool. Well, I'll tell you what, James. What I'm going to do for the rest of them watching, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm gonna put his links to his Instagram and to his website in the description below. And then if you're listening on Audible, you just got what he shared. So that's how they can connect with you. And again, appreciate your time, brother. This was so good, and I can't wait to continue this journey and continue to learn from you and journey this road together as we both grow in our marriages and in our fatherhood journey and learn from one another and those around us. So thank you for this time today, brother. I
Yeah,
appreciate it
thank
so
you,
much.
Mitch. Thanks for having me on.
All right, all right. I hope that episode was as impacting for you as it was for me. I got a lot to take away from this, a lot to process, and just thinking through my own emotions and how I handle them in the moment, the breath control, the breath supports, and processing. There's just a ton of stuff here. So I hope you enjoyed it. And listen, if you're watching on YouTube, I want to hear from you. So I want to know, what was your big takeaway? What was the aha moment? What was the big insight that you got from this episode? And drop it in the comments below, because I want to know that these podcasts are impacting you in a positive way. So listen, that's all for today, but do not forget to tune in next week where we're going to be talking about how to form great habits and how to kick bad habits for good. Okay, I'm going to be unpacking this process from a psychological perspective, and I'm going to give you a ton of tools and systems that you can implement today in order to form great habits, kick bad habits, and change your behavior forever. All right, it's going to be a powerful episode, so tune in next Monday, and the podcast episode will drop at 5 a.m. like we do every single week. Okay, so that's it for me, but listen, I am in your corner, all right? If you need anything, if you want to chat about anything you've learned on this show, please reach out to me at mitchell@dadnationco.com or hit me up on Instagram @dadnationco, and would love to continue the conversation with you and what you're learning, okay? All right, guys, have a fantastic week. We'll catch up soon.